Welcome. Hello and welcome. I have been working very hard at trying to find the best way of discussing the first cue from the Phantom Menace, because there is so much involved in this. So I thought the first thing I would do is actually just go through the film that I did before on YouTube, kind of like annotating it, and then trying to find a way of just talking about it as we go along. So I've got lots and lots of materials which I've prepared here. So the first thing is that I've done a reduction, not quite as good as Brad Frey. So sorry, Brad, it's not as good as yours. You're much better at this than I am. But anyway, I have attempted to do a reduction of the first cue from the Phantom Menace and trying to make head or tail of it. And the most interesting thing for me is the harmony. But before we do that, I think it's worthwhile just to sort of put this in context. So I'm actually going to go through the film from the video that I posted last week on YouTube and try and make a little bit of sense with it. Of course, my screen's up there. That's why I'm looking there. Let's put into enter full screen, just so we can see it a little bit clearer. If I do that, that doesn't really make any difference at all. So never mind. I will go through it as well. So I think just this is more of a sort of contextual analysis, really. So obviously we just heard the big credits, which I'm going to talk about how the main title, actually it's not credits, the main title, isn't it? How the main title goes straight into the next little passage of music. We tend to hear that chord quite a lot. Even finding out what that chord is sort of contentious as well. So there's all sorts of things going on. In a sense, that's an A-flat augmented chord with a 7th on it, or it's a C major chord with a flat 6 on it. All sorts of different ways of approaching this thing, which is why it's sort of quite tricky to talk about. Anyway, let's have a look at Phantom Menace with the actual score. And then I'll try and talk about it a little bit. I mean, first of all, actually, the music's dubbed incredibly low. You just hear this sort of huge sound. There was a wonderful article, I believe, in a book that Frank Lehman has sourced, I think, or cited in his book, which is all about the sound of Hollywood film composers, and it's really interesting. They're talking about the myth and the fact that there's this sort of heightened sense of sound in a lot of the Star Wars films, also visually as well.
Captain.
Yes, sir.
Tell them we wish to...
So the first thing is, generally speaking, it starts with this sort of mystery. So we've got... and I'm going to come on to that second bar scale a little bit later on. I've called it hexatonic set. And this is something that he uses an enormous amount. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's carry on for the time being. But in a sense, it's a sort of set of mystery. The hexatonic set, you can get 2 augmented chords interposed or juxtaposed with each other. And the idea of the augmented chord is something that tends to evoke sort of mystery. In fact, again, Frank was talking about this. This is Frank Lehman in his book Hollywood Harmony. And I think he says this about it. So this is from page 78, 79-ish. So the scale's distinctively gapped, exotic-sounding quality derives from its interval class pattern, which is basically semitone, then minor third. That sort of idea. And you get 4 other hexatonic scales, or of the 4 sort of possible hexatonic scales, he says each supports 6 triads, 2 each per note of an augmented triad. Like the octatonic scale, so 8 notes, the hexatonic scale precludes root motion by fifth and thus the ability to assert diatonic functionality. In other words, it means that we can't pinpoint a functional key or tonal center because of the fact that it's symmetrical. So by the time that you transpose it up, let's say a couple of times, it's gone to, or 3 times, it's gone back to the beginning of the the root note, or the so-called root note. In other words, it's not possible to formulate a root or a dominant. So he goes on to say its affiliation with the augmented chord has lent the collection long-standing associations with disorientation, wonderment, and the supernatural, which is really interesting. And he quotes a chap called Michael Friedman, who dubs the associated set class 620 the magic hexachord. This is the magic hexachord. And I find that really wonderful. At the beginning of Phantom Menace, it's sort of, we haven't seen a Star Wars film at that point for a number of years. And it suddenly just sort of goes onto this sort of rather magical, mysterious quality. We can see the Jedi in the background as well. So it's sort of mysterious. We're not quite sure who they are at this point.
Tell them we wish to board at once.
With all...
Captain.
Yes, sir.
Tell them we wish to board at once.
With all due respect, the ambassadors for the Supreme Chancellor wish...
So the ambassadors for the Supreme Chancellor. But there's a real mystery going on around here. That sort of hexatonic set is still heard again in bar 5.
Board immediately.
Yes, of course. As you know, our blockade is perfectly legal.
And again, just as we get into that, we've got, again, sort of more... a lot of these sort of minor chords with a major 7th. They have an effect of being augmented. This sort of idea as well. Quite dissonant chords. And again, they have, I think, absolutely correct, a feeling of disorientation and wonderment at the same time. There's a mystery. The Phantom Menace. What is this phantom? In fact, we get to see it very, very early on.
Our blockade is perfectly legal, and we'd be happy to receive the ambassador.
So that's really interesting. As soon as we see the droid army ship here, we've got a little hint in sort of 4 or 5 bars of this sort of ominous threat. First of all, the basses come in. So again, orchestrationally, threat tends to be just add some bass to it and you'll get a sense of threat. That's not true of everything, but generally true. If you've had sort of something high and then it has this sort of feeling of threat, possibly. In fact, interestingly enough, I think that in these 2 bars here, bar 9 and 10, they're the only 2 bars that I can sort of analyse with, like, oh, it's an E chord in first inversion, and it's an F sharp sort of dominant chord in first inversion. Those are the only 2 chords. Everything else is a polychord or some sort of hexachord or some sort of atonal chord, pretty much all the way through, or non-chordal. So I mean, here we have a sort of monody, which is sort of basically on in fourths, but essentially that's sort of derived from the Phrygian mode at that point. So he's setting up an association with the droid army, sort of just hinting at it in this first cue, which is actually quite a long cue in some ways. There's a militaristic aspect to this. Also, there's a very sort of static quality to it, as well as sort of almost pristine cleanliness to it, which I think, interestingly enough, at the time, it was one of the sort of things that people didn't like about the Phantom Menace, that everything looks fake. It's unfortunate because I think the idea behind it, or the intention behind it, was that everything is supposed to look sort of very clean and pristine. And, you know, this was an age where sort of many years before the dirt and the grime of the rebellion, everything looked clean. You know, there's no dirt anywhere at all. And it's a sort of interesting thing that the music sort of reflects that. It's almost sort of column-esque, almost like those sort of, you know, there are a lot of these sort of Corinthian columns and sort of rather almost sort of Greek Roman architecture that you sort of see associated with, I don't know, Coruscant and other places as well. And it's interesting that everything sort of seems very column-esque, static or monumental, really. And interestingly, I find that the music reflects that in certain ways. So here, there's a sort of repetitious aspect to it that's quite unlike other bits of music and from the Star Wars franchise that we had heard before. And it's a way of sort of going, well, what would have the music have sounded like 20 years before the first film? How would that have functioned? It's really interesting. I don't think there's an answer to this, by the way. I'm sort of mulling and sort of almost sort of, you know, I've been thinking about it for a week before doing this vid. It's interesting. There was a book by a wonderful composer called John Paynter, Paynter, called Sound and Structure. And one of the exercises, it's a book for teaching composition. And one of the exercises in it is to listen to a piece by Messiaen, which I think is called Et Expecto Resurrectionem Mortuorum. I think. I'm just doing that off the top of my head. But it's very column-esque in the sense there's no development at all. It's just a block of sound, and then another block of sound, and then another block of sound. I get sort of that feeling sometimes from generally the music of the Phantom Menace, where, you know, he might have an ostinato pattern, and then we'll have another layer, and then another layer as well. It's an interesting sort of textural thing that he hadn't really done since Jaws, where you hear that, but there's also all sorts of other things going on the top of that. It's incredibly Stravinsky-esque in that regard. But anyway, so a sort of digression, really. But we've gone from the mystery into the droid army. Sort of, we haven't actually seen them at this point. And this sort of languid, sort of gliding through. I was watching a very interesting little segment about the lightsaber duels in Phantom Menace, and the fact that there's no weight behind the sword strike. It sort of glides through almost as if the force is sort of guiding the person wielding it, whether it's the dark side or light side is sort of irrelevant. And they have this grace about it. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of sort of flighty grace in the Phantom Menace's and the Attack of the Clones' music. It's this sort of, you know, descent. You know, this sort of like, almost sort of like a sort of wave goodbye, in a sense. It's really interesting. So now we see the droids, but there's no musical reference to them. And this is sometimes where, you know, Williams is very clever. He doesn't get in the way of stuff. He actually foreshadows all of this before with all of the sort of horn calls and the little trumpet fanfares as well. So we already know what to expect. It's something military. We can see there's a blockade going on here. And also the mystery as well. We've got this chord back again. That chord appears pretty much after every introduction to the first cue. Sometimes it's changed a little bit. I might actually reserve that for another video, concentrating on this first. But it's a really fascinating way of how does he get out of the the original that to there. And he does it pretty much all the time. The only real exception is actually Revenge of the Sith, where he goes immediately into this sort of that sort of idea as well, where you have a D flat chord in one hand and a C major chord in the other. Good way of thinking about it, I think. And a lovely sort of winding down effect, because as the scene changes now, that obviously they disembarked, some time has passed, there's a sort of like a sort of ripple effect, I guess, musically. We can actually hear it in the harp as well, in that chord, which appears a lot.
I'm TC-14 at your service. This way.
Again, this sort of a gliding, sort of mysterious, almost supernatural quality to it. Everything is an augmented chord. Pretty much everything is an augmented chord. So we start off with this chord here. We've also got sort of an octatonic type of idea. In fact, actually, you could also think of it as a reversed hexatonic scale, where you have your minor second, so semitone, and then minor third. That's in the piano, which is sort of liberally sort of ad-libbing. Like that, all the way through. It's sort of fluttering. And then we've got our sort of G augmented chord at the top as well. I mean, I sort of interestingly called it an E minor with a major seventh. We don't really get an E there, so I'm not sort of now looking back on it convinced that I'm correct on that one. And then we get this sort of departure again, slightly. It's sort of, is it whole tony? Not really. It sort of is. Actually, it is a whole tone collection. That's why I wrote whole tone collection. So I don't know why I wrote E minor with a major seventh on there. Who knows? Who knows? There's no F sharp there. But anyway, the point is that they're all sort of augmented chords. With extraordinary sort of other hexatonic sets in there as well. But again, it's this feeling of mystery. Who are they, these ambassadors?
Please.
Again, we're not sure. So it's all of these sort of augmented chords going on.
We are greatly honored by your visit, ambassadors. Make yourselves comfortable. My master will be with you shortly.
I have a
Brilliant. And as they take their hoods off, we get this extraordinary sort of harp glissando. So we've got, you know, very much an augmented chord going on at the same time. And this extraordinary sort of augmented chord again, or set, hexatonic set, I suppose you would call it, as the Jedi revealed as well.
feeling about this.
I don't sense anything.
I've got a bad feeling about this. We've heard that so many times before. But Qui-Gon doesn't sense it. But Obi-Wan does. There's something which is menacing already. And it's really interesting musically. That's described by this sort of very strange sort of Celeste idea. We've also got it on the violins. And it's a really almost sort of fully chromatic set at this point. If we again put all the notes together, we've got a sort of rather beautiful set. I've called it 7/4. Again, I'll come on to that later. Let's just have a review.
It's not about the mission, Master. It's something elsewhere.
Again, something elusive, something mysterious. Bang. Here's the augmented chord again.
Don't center on your anxieties, Obi-Wan. Keep your concentration here and now where it belongs.
But Master Yoda said I should be mindful of the future.
But not at the expense of the moment. Be mindful of the living force, young Padawan.
Yes, Master.
So he's sort of gone into the fact that something's going on. I don't know what it is. Well, just don't worry about it, because you need to stop basically putting your anxieties before the present moment. Of course, they've all been deceived. Obi-Wan's the only person who realizes that something's amiss. That's the power of the dark side, is that everything, the Jedi's minds are clouded. Very much like the harmony is clouded. There's no sort of discernible tonic. We've got sort of various augmented chords, but they're so sort of infused with chromaticism that it's sometimes difficult to know where we are. Interestingly enough, here, there's very little sense of bass as well. Everything's sort of high as well.
How do you think this trade viceroy will deal with the Chancellor's demands?
These Federation types are cowards.
Again, we've got this sort of other sort of hexatonic sets, and very much bar 42. I've got this sort of, you know, very sort of chromatic as well going on, almost atonal.
The negotiations will be short.
What?
And now we have the sense of, oh, something dark is happening.
What did you say?
The ambassadors are Jedi Knights, I believe.
I knew it.
And again, we have this really extraordinary, basically 12-tone missing an A natural. So it's 11 notes of the chromatic scale. Glad I wasn't sight reading this in a... Imagine trying to have to get that right first time. And then it sort of, you know, is played ad lib. We've also got this very interesting sort of slow high harmonic glisses on the violins as well. They're just sort of extremely high. And then we've got this dropped minor third. It's a slight hint to that sort of dark side quality where you have minor chords. By the way, all the Rebels is major chord to major chord, isn't it? But here we have a slight hint. And in a sense, it's a reverse of the Emperor's theme. Which I guess is a sort of the modern equivalent of that sort of, you know, hackneyed sort of idea of, you know, evil is coming. I don't even know where that's from. Maybe somebody can write in and tell me. But this one, that sort of idea, where is it actually from? Anyway, so we've got this sort of hint of Palpatine, I guess. We don't really know. I guess for the fans, they would already know what Palpatine sort of grows into. But for those who don't, there's very much a menacing quality to it. The Phantom Menace.
They're here to force a settlement.
And sorry about that. I love the fact that we've got these trombones which sort of like go outwards. It's a really extraordinary piece of... It's an augmented sixth chord. And then goes to a sort of diminished triad. Really extraordinary.
What? What did you say?
The ambassadors are Jedi Knights, I believe.
I knew it. They're here to force a settlement. Distract them. I will...
Nice. They're here to force a settlement. The music's changed, but that's when the muted trombones come in.
Daglot Sidious.
Are you brain dead? I'm not going in there with two Jedi.
That doesn't really make sense, the dialogue. This time I'll contact Lord Sidious. Are you brain dead? I'm not going in there. That's a sort of non sequitur. It doesn't really make any sense at all. Just realised.
Send a droid.
Now the droid, being a protocol droid, has to poison the Jedi.
Is it in their nature to make us wait?
Again, the Jedi have this sort of, elusive sort of... sorry, wrong alto. This sort of idea going on again.
Long?
No, I sense an unusual amount of fear for something as trivial as this trade dispute.
And that's where we hear the Rasaba. And I'll go into the next cue at some stage later on. So that's all of that sort of done. We've sort of talked about quite a lot of it. I want to go into more depth about this hexatonic set because obviously when I was sort of analysing it, it was one of those things where I sort of thought, I wonder what are those notes? There's a very good website actually, which is a set calculator. You just put it into Google and you can put in the notes. So for those of you who don't or are not necessarily familiar with pitch class sets, it's just a way of analysing notes, melodies and chords that don't necessarily conform to a sort of, a common chord or key. So it was a way of analysing atonal music. Without getting into too much detail. So what I did is I put some of these notes into, or what I thought was a sensible collection of notes into the PC set calculator, and it gave me various numbers. Those numbers are basically, were, I guess, enumerated or listed by Alan Fort. Some people call him Forte, which is sort of quite interesting. But anyway, he came up with a list of these pitch classes. Again, even on Wikipedia, actually, is sort of a rather good place to have a look at these things. And we discovered that 620 is a special set called the Ode to Napoleon hexachord. A little pop-up says, is the hexachord named after its use in the 12-tone piece Ode to Napoleon by Arnold Schoenberg, which is a string quartet, singer and piano. So piano quintet, I guess, with a singer. And it contains pitch classes 014. So what happens is that middle C, or C, is 0. C sharp would be 1, D 2, E flat 3, E natural is 4, etc. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There we go. It's a hexatonic set. It's only got 6 notes in the scale. There are no Bs and there are no Ds in there. So if we actually go on to it, it's an interesting one because you can see here, this is a sort of in prime form. So when it's reduced to the shortest possible amount of space between any given notes, interval classes, we've got a C augmented chord and also a D flat augmented chord as well. So we've got sort of 2 superimposed augmented triads, which give composers a lot of possibilities. A bit like the octatonic set, which has been used by, well, John Williams as much as others, but I guess Rimsky-Korsakov, Stravinsky, and Shostakovich definitely, where his name D-S-C-H-D-S or E flat C-H, German for B natural, you can extend it and it becomes an octatonic set. This one's slightly different because it's a symmetrical set, and thus only has a limited mode of transposition. There are only, I think, 2 transpositions or 3 transpositions that you can get out of it before it becomes the same notes. It's called the Magic Hexachord. If we look at Michael Friedman, Ear Training for the 20th Century, page 198, it's a good citation there. This is where citations actually are good in Wikipedia. So it's one of those things that you can sort of go, oh, right, I'm going to try and write I mean, would you write an entire piece based upon just one hexatonic set? I suppose you could. But it's just a tool. And I think, with Williams's music, all of these things, maybe he was aware of it, maybe not. In a sense, it doesn't really matter. His instinct is to use it, and to use it in a way which ascribes a certain type of emotive value to it. In this case, it's mystery. And it's amazing how much sense of mystery we get from this first cue. And of course, the film is entitled The Phantom Menace. And I think on the original autograph score that we've got, he knows what the film's called. Sometimes it wasn't known what the film was called, or the film's name changed. The Revenge of the Jedi. Jedi don't have revenge. The Return of the Jedi. So it was changed. But on the autograph score, it says The Revenge of the Jedi. So in this one, he sort of knows what it's about. So I'd imagine that as he's, spotting the film, he, certain ideas start formulating in his mind. What is this thing? It's very mysterious. And so it's unsurprising that those sorts of hexatonic sets, or even 7-note sets, scales, come to his mind. And I think that's sort of quite significant. Anyway, you can go on into this even more than you want to, or could. So it allows triads of G minor, E flat minor, and B minor to appear as easily. Interesting, because I'm sure that is a motive from A New Hope. It's a sort of the Darth Vader sort of imperial idea. That's really interesting. It all sort of seems to link in. And it's not just leitmotif that links all of these films at all. It's the harmony. And when you go into it in a sort of quite a lot of detail, as I have, you begin to sort of see patterns which form. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter what you label them. Because labeling is different for everybody. In a sense, it's for you to understand, or how you best understand it. If I have a C sharp minor chord and then F minor, you could do that, or an A flat chord as well. All sorts of different ways of sort of interpreting this. C sharp minor with a major 7th. We've got a sort of non-harmonic intruder in these. It's this sort of trickling melody that is extremely dissonant, which sort of interferes with what's going on. And really extraordinary chords. So sort of F augmented with an F minor chord in the top, or the hexatonic set. Like that as well. So, and then we got this minor chord with a major 7th. That has a feeling of augmentedness because of the 3rd note from the root, the 5th note from the root, and the 7th note from the root. So it's rootless augmented chord. You could keep going, and it sort of becomes sort of rather symmetrical. So what else is there? So we got these little hints as the piece goes on. Then we've got, I guess you would call them more pure augmented chords. But I'm going to regard, B minor with a major 7th. All of those things are augmented, really. Then we've got sort of lovely addition here, where you have sort of B flat minor, with a little it's sort of added 13 on there. We've got another minor chord with a major 7th, and they pretty much appear all the way through. So this is the bit where which I pointed out earlier, where the sort of the bass creeps in for the first time, and then we get into the militaristic droid army. I've sort of got a feeling of here B Phrygian mode. And a sense, I said telescoped in the sense that it's sort of spread melodically out over the next sort of 2 or 3 bars. But of course, he doesn't always, you know, it should go to that bar. But actually there's a semitonal descent, which goes from the F sharp into E sharp. And then we've got these little thirds which sort of appear sometimes as seconds as well. You know, just little hints of change and development. Again, you have to have that because the cue's quite long and you need to maintain the sense of flow and change throughout. We've then got this set here, 6Z19. Again, it's a sort of one of these ones which has some sort of relationship behind it. It's quite close to 20. It's just a couple of notes that are sort of not, or just one interval apart from 620. But we've heard that so many times. And it's maintained. It's interesting actually how often it's maintained around the note C. I mean, usually with Williams, you know, tonal centers aren't really particularly important. They don't have the same function that they did in the 19th century at all. But it's interesting how that set doesn't really get transposed particularly. It's maintained throughout. Again, you can see that chord is maintained throughout a lot. Then when we get into this sort of the idea of there's something mysterious going on, Qui-Gon, what's going on? Well, it doesn't matter. Just, you know, focus on the here and now. Again, we've got the same sort of set here. You can regard this as E minor with E flat minor. Essentially, they're all sort of, if you sort of combine them all, they just make a nice scale, a sort of invented scale. All of these augmented chords all the way through. All the way through. Again. Where you have a sort of transformation, but with a sort of wrong bass, I guess you would call it. So it get C augmented with a major 7th, but with F in the bass. It's not a chord of F, but it's just an F in the bass. Then we've got this sort of extraordinary chromaticism, which I pointed out before, and then back to the major chords with or augmented chords. Here we've got something slightly different, but it's an effect of having a chord and then adding another note in it. You could do that, or you could do that. So when you're sort of trying to perhaps emulate Williams's style, you don't necessarily need to think of, oh, I'm going to use 6/20 set now. Don't do that. Maybe just think of a chord and change one of the notes chromatically. And as soon as you do that, you start getting really interesting collections of pitches, which you can then exploit. So I think the theory's good to a certain degree, but I wouldn't get too bogged down with it. I've pointed out that we've got 6/20 again, this hexatonic set, and this is why I actually go into it. And it relates to the original trilogy in that regard, that you have those thirds which you know, the tertiary relationship is one of the main sort of thrusts of film music, harmony. You know, chords that go up a third, tonal centers that go up a third. It's very much part and parcel of the DNA of music. This is an interesting one where you've got E minor, E flat minor, literally together. Almost sort of Bartok type sort of idea there. And I love the fact that he keeps the harp and the celeste going all the way through. Again, the connotation is one of mystery, and I don't really know what's going on. We don't know what's going on harmonically. I think one of the followers on YouTube sort of remarked on that, which I laughed at, because, yeah, we don't really know. Bit meta, isn't it? But I love it. Then I've got this sort of this other hexachord, the Schoenberg Hexachord, which prime is 012569. So let's work out what that is. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, again, it just feels like John Williams. It feels like Star Wars. It doesn't feel like Rite of Spring at that point. We've forgotten all about that. And also just, you know, the orchestration of having slightly not aleatoric moments, because they're all written down. They're not chants. They're very well thought out. But I love the sort of ad-lib nature of things, leaving it up to the performers to do and working it out in the studio, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do these days, because money is time and time is money. But I love the fact that they were able to experiment with this, and I think more studios should do that, and allow people to make mistakes and allow people to do a retake. You know, what the hell? What's a couple of £1,000 when you've already spent so much money getting there in the first place? The next little bit, actually, interestingly enough, orchestrationally, that the whole thing is a lot more blended than a lot of other pieces that John Williams has done. So, you know, even the bass here, you would think, okay, maybe I'd do contrabassoon, tuba, maybe bass trombone if it's not too low. And there we go. Yeah, it was harp, tuba, trombone, contrabassoon, and double bass. Everything blended. So very nice there. So back into the other augmented chords, which we had before. Really extraordinary chord there. Very sort of atonal, really. And then we got C minor with a major 7th. With a couple of other extra notes added in for good measure. Again, it's 6 sed 19. We've seen that before. That maintains. It's related also to the minor chord with a major 7th, minor chord with a major 7th. And then the very last chord is this sort of G minor 9 with a flat 5. Yeah, what have we got there? So that idea. Really extraordinary chords and really extraordinary harmony, which is just put to such good effect. These wispy, sort of fluty, artificial harmonics are really important as well, played on the first and second violins. Also with cellos with a thumb position harmonic as well. Very difficult to get absolutely in tune first time. So a dangerous thing to end on because it's so exposed. It's slightly supported with vibes, but they're not necessarily hitting the same note. So that A is certainly not hitting the same as a B flat, which is going to sound, D flat, 2 octaves higher. So yeah, it's a very exposed little bit of music at that point. Needed a good orchestra, needed some excellent players to play it first time. That is a, I feel, all too brief analysis of 1M3. What's interesting about it was that because it sparked up such a rabbit hole for me, I then ended up thinking about how, just gonna get rid of that, how that augmented mystery appears. So in the next video, just a quick preview, I've done the last little bit of the main title and done a reduction of it. Don't need that. Let's get rid of that. Silly. In a little bit more like a Brad Frey. Thanks, Brad. Very, very good. That website is superb. That YouTube channel is brilliant. Film score analysis. Just click onto it. It's so good. Brad Frey. F-R-E-Y. So I've done a reduction of all the sort of little leads up into the first 3 or 4 bars of the film. Because they always have this idea. Usually as a trill or as a sort of... was a sort of, you know, a broken arpeggio, broken chord. So I've gone into A New Hope first. I've done this sort of slightly out of order, but it's to show the DNA of it because that was the first one done in terms of composition. So it makes sense to do that a little bit. But then because we were talking about Phantom, I've gone straight into that. It's pretty much the same as the previous chord, but only for 2 beats. Anyway, I'll come on to that, and then I've gone into Clones and Sith and Empire and Return of the Jedi, even The Force Awakens as well. So probably next one will be slightly shorter than the one of today. But yeah, I mean, hopefully just discussing the fact that that Williams uses hexatonic sets and is quite happy to use them, we can get a real sort of respect for the intricacy of the harmony. And I fell in love with it. It's absolutely addictive when you start sort of really going into it. And again, a friend of mine had said very insightfully that, you know, Williams will use a couple of bits of hexatonic sets, and then he might use an octatonic set, and then he might use sort of chordal harmony, and then he might go back to a hexatonic set. What's interesting about this cue in The Phantom Menace was that hexatonic set, or sets, because there's not just one, sometimes there are 2 or 3, that's kind of maintained throughout. And the minor chord with a major 7th is something that is very much part of the DNA. It's the first chord that you get after the main title. And so it's unsurprising that then it sort of inflects the rest of the film. What's particularly apt in The Phantom Menace is because we don't really know what's going on at that point. It's really useful to describe the scene with that chord, because it's very apt. That's what a composer might immediately think of. I'm always fascinated why composers have used certain chords and the functions of those chords, and I think here it's obviously to evoke a sense of mystery and wonder and foreboding as well at the same time, plus introducing just a couple of those sort of militaristic themes that we get a little bit later on. So next video I'll talk about that DNA a little bit more, and then we'll continue with Phantom Menace. I will get round to doing other films, I promise, but it's going to take a while. I think there's no reason to rush. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed this week's video. Take care.
Goodbye.